June 6, 1944. Before sunrise, the western horizon of France flickered with unnatural light. Naval guns thundered from the English Channel, their shells streaking toward the Normandy coast. Above, the deep drone of aircraft engines filled the sky, carrying paratroopers who hurled themselves into the darkness below. It was the greatest invasion the world had ever seen. Yet, even as thousands of Allied soldiers braced to storm the beaches, German commanders hesitated. The question that haunted them was simple. Was this truly the invasion of France, or merely a diversion? For months, German intelligence had been fed a steady stream of reports convincing them that the main blow would fall not in Normandy, but further north at the Pas-de-Calais. Hitler himself clung to this belief. In the early hours of June 6th, as the thunder of war reached his commanders, the dictator slept soundly, assured that this was only the beginning of a ruse. The roots of that hesitation stretched far beyond the beaches of Normandy. They lay in whispered reports carried by double agents, in false radio traffic echoing across the Channel, and in the carefully orchestrated illusions of Operation Fortitude. In Berlin, the Abwehr believed it had loyal eyes in Britain. Agents who risked their lives to send details of Allied troop movements, landing craft, and invasion timetables. In reality, most of those agents had been captured long ago. Turned by MI5, they became the cornerstone of the double-cross system. What the Germans thought was truth was, in fact, a carefully woven tapestry of lies. At German headquarters in France, the picture looked convincing. Reports from trusted informants described an immense buildup of forces in southeastern England. An army under the command of General George S. Patton, supposedly poised to strike across the narrow Strait of Dover. Aerial reconnaissance confirmed what appeared to be camps, tanks, and landing craft massing in Kent. Yet much of it was a mirage. Inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, and dummy installations. The deception worked because it was reinforced constantly by human intelligence. Voices that the Germans believed, but that Britain controlled. For the soldiers in the landing craft heading toward Normandy, none of this deception mattered. Seasick, silent, clutching rifles slick with seawater, they prepared to charge into German defenses that bristled with machine guns and concrete bunkers. One paratrooper later recalled how, as his plane shook from flak, he whispered a prayer, certain that his life depended not only on his courage, but on whether the enemy had been fooled long enough to give them a chance. Meanwhile, in the French countryside, German troops peered into the night sky. Many were bewildered at the scale of the bombardment, yet their commanders urged caution. If this was merely a feint to rush reinforcements toward Normandy, would leave Calais exposed. Hitler's conviction held them in check. Hours passed, and divisions that might have crushed the fragile Allied beachhead remained idle, waiting for an invasion that never came. The Allies had gambled on deception, and the gamble was working. Ordinary men and women, Spanish refugees like Juan Pujol García, flamboyant Yugoslav playboys like Dusan Popov, and Poles, Norwegians, and Britons pressed into dangerous service, had become the architects of illusion. Through them, Berlin saw what London wanted it to see. The dawn of June 6th was more than a military operation. It was the culmination of years of lies, double crosses, and shadows cast across Europe. The fate of the greatest amphibious invasion in history hinged not only on soldiers storming beaches, but also on words, carefully planted in enemy ears. As the first waves hit the sand at Omaha, Sword, Juno, Gold, and Utah, the success of the entire operation balanced on a knife's edge. If the Germans realized the truth too soon, the Allied armies could be hurled back into the sea. If they continued to believe the deception, the beachheads might hold. That morning, under the pale light breaking over Normandy, the world stood at a crossroads. Victory or disaster rested not only in the clash of steel, but also in the invisible war of deception, a war fought by spies whose, names would remain unknown for decades, and so begins the story of those double agents, the men and women who deceived the Nazi war machine and ensured that, on D-Day, Hitler was looking in the wrong direction. The story of D-Day deception began not on the beaches of Normandy, but years earlier in the shadowed offices of London's MI5. In 1940, as bombs rained down during the Blitz and Britain fought for survival, another, quieter war unfolded, a war of spies, lies, and double lives. German intelligence, the Abwehr, had dispatched dozens of agents across the Channel. Some parachuted into fields at night, others slipped ashore from U-boats, and a few arrived under false papers through neutral countries. Their mission was clear: to gather intelligence on Britain's defenses, factories, and troop movements, and to prepare the way for an invasion Hitler still believed possible. But the Abwehr underestimated Britain's vigilance. Thanks to a combination of coastal watchers, vigilant police, and the new technology of radar, most of these spies were captured within hours or days of landing. For the British, the question was what to do with them. Execution was the traditional answer, but MI5 saw a more dangerous and more valuable opportunity. Thus was born the double-cross system. At its heart was John Cecil Masterman, a historian turned spy master who chaired the 20 Committee, so named because the Roman numerals XX symbolized double-cross. Under his guidance, captured German agents were given a choice: face the hangman's noose or work for Britain as a double agent. Many chose survival, but survival came at a cost. Every message they sent, every detail they passed along, would be carefully rewritten by British handlers, designed to mislead the enemy without arousing suspicion. The risk was immense. If a single detail was exposed as false, an agent's cover could be blown. The Abwehr might realize the betrayal, and British deception operations could collapse. One interrogator later recalled the tension in those first encounters. "You had men sitting across from you who would gladly see London in flames, and yet we asked them to serve us." Among the first to be turned were men like Arthur Owens, codenamed Snow, a Welshman who had been feeding scraps of intelligence to the Germans before his capture. Others followed, some eager opportunists, some reluctant patriots of convenience. Their lives became a tightrope walk, writing letters, encoding signals, and transmitting radio messages under the watchful eyes of MI5. The Germans, however, remained convinced of their loyalty. Reports flowed back to Berlin describing everything from convoy sailings to aircraft production, much of it carefully salted with just enough truth to maintain credibility. This was the genius of the double-cross system. Never deny reality completely, but bend it, shape it, and slowly lead the enemy toward the conclusions Britain desired. For MI5 officers, the work required patience and precision. In cramped rooms lit by flickering lamps, handlers guided their agents, word by word, through radio transmissions, ensuring consistency in style and detail. German controllers praised their spies, unaware that every sentence was crafted under British control. The double agents themselves lived under extraordinary pressure. At any moment, a slip in language or a contradiction in reporting could cost them their lives. One recalled later that the silence after each transmission was unbearable. You sent your message into the night, and then you waited, not knowing if tomorrow they would see through the lie. These early experiments in deception proved decisive. By 1941, virtually every German agent in Britain was under British control. Instead of piercing the fog of war, the Abwehr was being fed a steady diet of falsehoods. It was a victory of patience and imagination, a triumph not of bombs or tanks, but of psychology and trust. What began as a desperate gamble in the dark days of 1940 became the foundation for something far larger. The double-cross system would evolve into one of the most sophisticated deception networks in history. It would later shape the course of Operation Fortitude. The grand plan that convinced Hitler the real Allied invasion would come at Calais, not Normandy, but in 1940 and 1941, no one could yet see that far ahead. Britain stood alone, battered by the Blitz, clinging to survival. And yet, even then, in the smoke and rubble of London, seeds of deception were being planted. Seeds that would one day bloom into the shadow war that fooled Hitler himself. If the double-cross system was the machinery of deception, its gears were the agents themselves. A collection of misfits, dreamers, patriots, and opportunists who, against all odds, rewrote the fate of the Second World War. Each carried a code name, a carefully constructed identity, and a story so improbable that it often sounded like fiction. Yet these were the real architects of Hitler's confusion on D-Day. The most celebrated of them all was Juan Pujol García, known to MI5 as Garbo, a Spaniard with no military background. Pujol detested both fascism and communism. Rejected by British recruiters at first, he approached the Germans offering his services. With a flair for imagination, he invented an entire spy network of 27 agents. Businessmen, sailors, diplomats, even a woman in Glasgow. None of them existed. Yet, through elaborate reports, delivered with a mix of truth and careful fabrication, he convinced the Abwehr that he was their star agent in Britain. It was a war of imagination, one handler later recalled, and Garbo's imagination was endless. To Berlin, his network seemed in 20D. The pressure on them was relentless. Every coded radio message, every report carried the possibility of exposure. Abwehr officers were skilled interrogators. Suspicion could spell torture or execution for their families back home. MI5 handlers kept their agents alive by weaving a tapestry of partial truths. A convoy's departure might be reported, but its timing altered. An air raid's results might be described, but exaggerated or understated. The Germans, hungry for detail, never realized they were being fed a feast of lies. In intelligence files, terse notes captured the tension. Agent nervous, one reads. Another, subject fears discovery. Requires reassurance. For the agents themselves, the work was nerve-shattering. As one later recalled, every word I sent was a blade's edge. If the Germans doubted me, I would not live to see another day. Yet against all odds, these spies thrived. Their lies, layered with precision and daring, became the bedrock of deception. By 1944, the Abwehr trusted them so deeply that Berlin's strategic assumptions about where, when, and how the EBE allies would invade Europe rested on the reports of men and women who had no loyalty to the Reich at all. As D-Day approached, the stage was set. The double-cross agents had built reputations strong enough to shape Hitler's decisions. Now their greatest test loomed, to convince him that the real blow would fall not on Normandy, but on Pas-de-Calais. As the invasion of Europe drew near, the Allies understood that victory on the beaches of Normandy depended not only on force of arms, but on the shadows of illusion. Operation Fortitude became the grand deception, a campaign designed to make. Hitler believed that the real blow would fall across the Strait of Dover, at Pas-de-Calais, rather than on the beaches of northern France. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. If the Germans saw through the ruse, the landings on June 6th could end in catastrophe. At its heart, Fortitude relied on the credibility painstakingly built by the double-cross agents. Men like Garbo, Brutus, and Tricycle fed a steady stream of reports to the Abwehr, reinforcing the idea that the massive Allied buildup in southern England was concentrated around Kent. These reports spoke of troop movements, supply dumps, and even whispered rumors of an army led by none other than General George S. Patton, the commander most feared by the Germans. The Wehrmacht believed Patton was the Allies' best general. One officer later wrote, "So they assumed he would lead the decisive strike." To support these lies, the Allies built an army that did not exist. Inflatable Sherman tanks sat in fields, their canvas skins gleaming in the summer sun. Wooden aircraft were parked on runways, their silhouettes convincing enough to fool aerial reconnaissance. Entire camps of tents were erected, filled with dummies and props. Radio operators transmitted endless streams of fake traffic, simulating the chatter of divisions preparing for battle. The deception was so thorough that one British officer described the scene as a theater of war, staged in fields and skies, where every detail was part of the script. Meanwhile, German intelligence, hungry for information, clung to every scrap sent by their supposed agents. Garbo's fictional network reported that convoys were assembling in Kent, awaiting the signal to cross at Calais. Brutus confirmed. These rumors, reinforcing the illusion of an invasion force poised just 20 miles from the French coast. In reality, the troops preparing for Normandy were concealed further west, their camps guarded by secrecy and silence. For the agents themselves, the tension was unbearable. Each coded transmission carried mortal risk. If the Abwehr had uncovered the deceit, not only would the agents have been executed, but the entire Allied invasion might have been compromised. One agent later admitted, "Every report I sent felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss. If the Germans doubted me, the whole war could be lost." The scale of the deception reached surreal proportions. In southern England, local civilians sometimes stumbled upon inflatable tanks or wooden aircraft, laughing at the absurdity. Yet, the ruse was deadly serious. From the air, Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs showed fields bristling with armor, harbors teeming with landing craft, and radio signals buzzing with activity. To Berlin, these were unmistakable signs of a massive invasion force. Even Hitler himself was persuaded. Obsessed with the possibility of an assault on Calais, he ordered Panzer divisions to remain in reserve, holding them back from Normandy even after the landings began. For weeks after June 6th, German High Command refused to commit its armored strength, convinced that Normandy was a diversion. "The real attack is still to come," one German field officer wrote in his diary, reflecting the grip of Fortitude's illusion. The success of the operation lay not only in its theatrical displays, but in its timing. Deception messages were carefully synchronized with real movements, creating a seamless illusion. When Allied bombers struck targets near Calais, agents reported that these were preparatory attacks for the coming invasion. When supply convoys moved west, they were described as feints, intended to mislead German observers. Every lie was anchored in fragments of truth, making it all the harder to unravel. By June 1944, the deception was complete. The Germans had redeployed divisions northward, leaving Normandy less defended than it might have been. When the Allies stormed ashore on June 6th, Rommel's forces were stretched thin, their reserves trapped by orders that anticipated a second, larger blow at Pas-de-Calais. Operation Fortitude was more than a trick. It was deception on an industrial scale, executed with precision and creativity. Inflatable tanks, phantom divisions, and false radio chatter might seem absurd, but together with the courage of the double cross agents, they reshaped the battlefield before the first Allied soldier set foot on French soil. As the first reports of the Normandy landings reached Berlin, German commanders hesitated, still convinced that the decisive battle was yet to come at Calais. It was hesitation born not of doubt, but of deception, and it would cost them dearly. Dawn broke on June 6, 1944, with fire and fury across the Normandy coast. The greatest amphibious invasion in history was underway. Yet even as Allied troops bled on the beaches, the true battle was unfolding in the minds of German commanders. For all the explosions, gunfire, and chaos, it was doubt, carefully cultivated by deception, that proved decisive. In Berlin and at German command posts along the French coast, reports from trusted agents poured in. Juan Pujol García, known to the Abwehr as Arabelle, but to the Allies as Garbo, transmitted urgent messages. He warned that the Normandy landings were a feint, a diversion meant to draw German attention away from the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais. His fictional network of 27 sub-agents confirmed the same story. To the Abwehr, these voices carried the weight of credibility. To the Allies, they were lies sharpened into weapons. The confusion reached Hitler himself. At his headquarters in East Prussia, the Führer awoke late, as he often did, and was briefed that Allied forces had landed in Normandy. Yet he remained, convinced that this was only the opening move of a larger operation. The decisive blow is still to come at Calais, he insisted, refusing to release the Panzer divisions that could have driven the Allies back into the sea. On the ground, German field commanders grew desperate. At Omaha Beach, where American TE troops were being cut down by machine guns and artillery, the lack of a concentrated German counterattack proved decisive. General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel had long argued that armored divisions must be positioned close to the coast, ready to strike within hours. But Rommel was away in Germany, and Hitler's orders, paralyzed by the illusion of Calais, kept the tanks idle. One German officer later reflected in his diary, "We waited for orders that never came, while the enemy carved his foothold in France." The paralysis was not simply strategic, it was psychological. For years, German intelligence had trusted its agents in Britain. Now, those very agents, every one of them controlled by MI5 under the double-cross system, delivered reports that reinforced Hitler's belief. Even after hours passed, with Allied forces pushing inland, Abwehr analysts assured their superiors that Normandy was a diversion. They expected Patton, the so-called Fire Brigade general, to lead the true assault at Calais. The phantom armies of Operation Fortitude still haunted their judgment. For the Allies, those lost hours became lifelines. At Utah Beach, American paratroopers secured causeways through the flooded fields. At Golden Juno, British and Canadian troops began to break through coastal defenses. And at Omaha, where disaster had seemed imminent, reinforcements and sheer determination allowed the Americans to finally climb the bluffs. Allied veterans would later recall that without German armor rushing to the beaches that morning, survival itself became possible. "Those tanks never came," one survivor said decades later, and that made all the difference. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence kept pressing the deception. Double agents continued sending updates to Berlin, claiming with urgency that Normandy was merely the opening act. These transmissions were timed to perfection, arriving just as German commanders debated their next moves. The Abwehr swallowed the bait whole. Even days later, when Allied forces had established a solid beachhead, Hitler still refused to redeploy divisions from Calais. The cost of hesitation was catastrophic. By the time Panzer divisions were finally ordered south, the Allies had secured ports, established supply lines, and inside MI5, the double-cross system remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. John Masterman and his colleagues knew that even after D-Day, the deception network could not be dismantled abruptly. The flow of disinformation had to continue, not only to sustain illusions about Calais, but to protect the agents themselves. A sudden silence would have aroused suspicion, and suspicion meant death for anyone the Germans still believed was serving them. The war's end brought little clarity. most double agents slipped quietly into obscurity. Their names remained hidden in locked files, their deeds unknown to the public. Some emigrated, seeking anonymity in foreign lands. Others tried to write memoirs, but official secrecy censored their words for decades. The double-cross system itself was not fully revealed until the 1970s, when declassified documents finally confirmed what few had known, that Britain had not only captured but controlled nearly every German spy sent to its shores. And with revelation came reflection. These men and women had not carried rifles into battle, yet their lies had altered the course of history. Without their fabrications, Panzer divisions might have crushed the Normandy landings. Without their carefully constructed illusions, Hitler might have concentrated his defenses where the Allies were weakest. In their silence and duplicity lay the fate of nations. Yet the legacy was bittersweet. Many lived with the gnawing knowledge that they would never be fully recognized, their victories buried under secrecy. One intelligence officer later remarked, "Their war was won in shadows, and in shadows it would remain." For the double agents themselves, history offered both triumph and erasure. Medals from enemies, silence from allies, and the weight of lives saved at the cost of endless deception. As the Allies swept across France and liberation spread through Europe, the great web of lies began to unravel. But the deception had done its work. Hitler had been fooled, D-Day had succeeded, and the course of the Second World War had been irreversibly altered. The agents faded back into obscurity, yet their legacy endured. Proof that in the greatest war mankind had ever waged, victory sometimes depended not on firepower, but on the fragile art of illusion. Dawn on June 6, 1944, had broken over Normandy with fire and thunder. The beaches were choked with men, machines, and the cost of war. Yet, as history later revealed, the success of that morning depended as much on whispers in the dark as on the rifles and landing craft that carried the Allies ashore. D-Day was not only a triumph of military might, it was a victory of deception, crafted by shadows who turned lies into weapons. The role of double agents in Operation Fortitude was decisive. Their carefully woven fabric of falsehoods held the German High Command in paralysis, convinced that the storm at Normandy was a feint. Panzer divisions that might have rolled against Omaha and soared beaches remained idle in the north, waiting for an invasion at Calais that never came. By the time Berlin realized the truth, the Allied foothold was secure. The cost had been immense, but without those hours bought by deception, it might have been catastrophic. Churchill hailed D-Day as the greatest amphibious operation ever undertaken. What he left unsaid was how much it had relied on men and women who never carried rifles into battle. Juan Pujol García, Garbo, spun his imaginary web of agents, convincing the Reich that its eyes and ears were loyal. Brutus, Tricycle, Tate, Zigzag, names that read like fiction, all played their part in sustaining the illusion. Their transmissions shaped strategy at the highest levels, altering the course of history with every coded word. The legacy of the double-cross system extended far beyond 1944. It demonstrated that intelligence was not merely about gathering secrets, but about shaping perception, bending an enemy's vision until they marched confidently into a trap. In the Cold War years that followed, the lessons of fortitude influenced both NATO and Warsaw Pact intelligence services. Deception was no longer a sideline to war. It had become one of its deadliest instruments. But for the agents themselves, the aftermath was more complex. Some lived in obscurity, their names hidden by secrecy for decades. A few were honored, like Garbo, who improbably received decorations from both Hitler and King George VI. Others faded into the gray margins of history, remembered only when intelligence files were finally unsealed. Their victories were buried under silence, their sacrifices written in invisible ink. Eyewitness reflections remind us of the personal cost. One British officer later noted, "They won battles without firing shots, but they carried the weight of knowing their lies sent men to die." The moral burden of deception was heavy, even when it served a cause as just as defeating Nazi tyranny. And yet, deception had changed the very nature of war. From camouflage to misinformation, from psychological operations to cyber warfare in our own age, the principle remains the same. Perception is as powerful as force. Operation Fortitude became the blueprint for every major deception since. As the film closes, we return to that first image, the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944. Soldiers huddled in landing craft, engines churning the sea, unaware that the fate of their survival balanced on messages tapped through radios hundreds of miles away. In those hours, deception became as vital as steel. The greatest invasion of the Second World War was secured not only by courage on the beaches, but by lies whispered in the dark. Lies that saved lives, won battles, and left a legacy still studied today. In the end, it was not only strength, but the art of illusion that doomed Hitler, proving that in war, truth may be powerful, but deception can be decisive.